Welcome back to another CBH Talk. Today I'm joined by Allan Greer, Professor of History at McGill University and one of Canada's leading historians of early North America. And we'll be discussing his article, Drinking on the Job, Liquor and Labor in the Staples Trades, and his upcoming book, Canada in the Age of Rum, which explores the surprising role that alcohol played in the economic life of early Canada. Now, when we think about the staples economy, fur, fish, and timber, we tend to focus on the commodities that drove trade and empire. But Allan's research shows that alcohol was actually deeply woven into the labor systems that supported those industries. And in many cases, liquor was not just recreational. It was actually part of how the work was organized, how workers were recruited and rewarded, and how social relationships were maintained in demanding environments. In this conversation, we'll explore how alcohol functioned within the workplace culture of the staples trades, what it reveals about labor relations in early Canada, and how it changes the way we think about the economic foundations of the country. I'm Tabitha Fritz, board member of the Canadian Business History Association, and I will be your host for today's conversation. Allan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So let's talk about one of the really unexpected insights in the article, and I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I'm sure it's there too, is why alcohol shows up everywhere in the archival record and why historians previously overlooked it.
Mm-hmm. They haven't totally overlooked it, but it only gets kind of glancing attention in what's been written in the past. And I came to realize that there was just an awful lot of rum in early Canada, Canada in quotation marks, since it's before Confederation, and that it seems to have been mostly consumed by people, actually men, working in resource extraction industries. So huge amounts go initially to the Newfoundland cod fishery. After the British conquer Quebec, it's all over the place, but particularly in the fur trade. What I hadn't realized until I got deeply into the subject was the way in which it was intimately woven into employment arrangements. So, of course, it's sometimes an enticement for people to sign on. You know, we're talking about in northern North America, we're talking about a labor market where labor, and particularly skilled labor, is in short supply, and therefore can command a high price for its services. Unlike in impoverished Europe, people can demand, pretty high wages. And so employers have to pay that, except because all these industries are undercapitalized. They can't just dole out pay every 2 weeks. They get people in both the fishery and the fur trade, and I believe it's the case in forestry as well. They get them to essentially sign a contract to provide their services for a season, sometimes for a period of 3 years, with the expectation they'll be paid at the end of that period, because the employer can only pay once they've actually sold their product, often abroad. So there's a delay in getting salaries paid. During that time, of course, the fishermen, the fur trade voyageurs, and others are essentially penniless. So that, and in the case of the fur trade, and to some extent, there's nowhere to buy anything anyway. So employers act as suppliers as well as employers. So they essentially say, look, if you need a new pair of boots, if you need some tobacco for your pipe, if you need a drink, we're happy to supply it. Rum comes into the picture early on, especially in the Newfoundland fishery, as a commodity that is cheap to buy, comes in from New England, but employers sell it to their employees at a huge markup. 4 to 500% of the cost to them. And they don't, and the transactions are more a matter of no money changes hands. Just on the contrary, it's a matter of keeping tabs on each employee's account. And what I found was that in both these industries, when men are isolated, bored, lonely. There's nothing much to do other than get drunk once in a while usually during downtime, but not necessarily. So when they reach the end of their employment period, and it would be time to say, okay, I'm ready to accept my pay now, the employer says, well, you actually have already spent it. It's it's already this it functions as a clawback on wages, and it looks as if in both the fishery and the fur trade, from the employer's point of view, it's a kind of necessary clawback, because if they actually paid workers what they had promised and contracted to pay in cash, they'd go broke. So this is their device for staying afloat in a high wage, low capital industry. I think I'd sum it up that way.
It's like that old folk song, I sold my soul to the company store, right?
A little bit.
Yeah. So alcohol was definitely used as an incentive for employment and obviously compensation. And one of the things I picked up from your article was that it was also really used as a ritual, like a workplace ritual, right? And I think, can you talk about that a little bit too, and how it sort of functioned in that way?
Yeah, I mean, not always, but for example, in the fur trade, we're talking about, these guys paddling canoes several thousand kilometers across the Canadian Shield from the head of Lake Superior up to, Lake Athabasca and the Mackenzie River and so on. They're built into their work routine is a series of moments when you drink. So in the fur trade, you have what's called a régal. When they first set off from what's now basically Thunder Bay, they stop at a convenient spot, pull out the rum, and everybody gets rip roaring drunk. I mean, I think in theory at the beginning it was a matter of, here's your quart of rum that you can have for drink over the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks. But of course, everybody just sloshes it all down. And the accounts talk about, everybody being jovial for a while and then fights breaking out. And then, one trader says, I looked around, there were 5 fights in progress at a given moment. And, by the end of the day, there was nothing but blood and torn shirts and black eyes and so on. So there's the régal. There's also when they reach their destination and they're having to overwinter. That's a lot of sitting around, doing not much. Mm-hmm. And they always celebrate New Year, to some extent Christmas and other occasions. And again, out comes the rum. And often the employer will give them a certain amount free of charge and get everybody somewhat high. And then there's the demand for more, and that gets charged to the account. And you get Northwest Company traders gloating over the way they've deliberately kind of primed the pump with a few free drinks and then got everybody hammered and drinking down their future wages.
Mm-hmm. Well, nefarious almost, really. Predatory, kind of. So, from a business history perspective, alcohol was a major commodity, right? Like a lot of this was taking place during the time of the Triangle Trade. So, we've really, alcohol was an important part of the economy of North America at the time. So, can you talk about how rum or even other spirits circulated through the commercial networks of the staples trades?
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting one because it, in a certain sense, fuels the Canadian staples trades that we're all familiar with, but it's also the product of another staples trade, a Caribbean one.
Right.
So of course it's not necessarily distilled in the Caribbean, but it's always made from sugarcane byproducts.
Mhm.
Um, basically the impurities that are scraped away when you're actually making sugar out of cane juice, plus molasses, which is a byproduct of refining sugar. Um, so, one of the features of this story is the way that it links together um, the Canadian staple trades and industries on the one hand, and the sugar slave complex of the Caribbean on the other. And we know how horrendous that was as a very violent and lethal environment. But anyway, it did produce these byproducts. So Canada's initially getting its rum from New England, not directly from the Caribbean. The Americans very cleverly go down to the West Indies with their products, and they find particularly they can get molasses cheap in the French West Indies, places like Martinique, Guadeloupe, because the French government discourages or prohibits the distillation of rum because they don't want it to compete with their home brandy industry at home. So whereas Barbados, Jamaica, places like that are manufacturing rum, the French West Indies are virtually throwing away their sugar byproducts, mostly molasses. The Americans buy them up cheap, take them north, and distill them into rum. So rum distilling is one of the biggest, or if not the biggest, industry in colonial North America. And places like Boston and Newport, Rhode Island, and all these places have their distilleries, and they get started partly because they want to supply. They want to sort of horn in on the Newfoundland fishery trade. So they take shiploads of supplies, including rum, to the coast of Newfoundland in the late 17th century, and work their way into supplying the fishery. So it's initially coming with Caribbean raw materials being transformed into alcohol in the New England colonies and coming into Canada that way. Eventually, distilleries are started here. There's the first two are in Halifax in the 1750s. There's later one in Quebec City, later a big one in Montreal. There's a large distillery in Montreal that's essentially a kind of subsidiary of the Northwest Company. So it's just like a direct pipeline, if you will, from this Montreal distillery up to the north and the west of Canada. So it's actually more complicated than just a triangle, if you will. But it certainly always has to start with the slave sugar complex in the West Indies.
That's interesting. Originally when the liquor was being produced in the I guess it was the US at the time, or the 13 colonies, if it was before 1776. Were the Canadian merchants deliberately importing alcohol with the knowledge that it would function as part of the labor system, or was that just sort of a byproduct?
Yeah, I don't think it was sort of an idea that someone hatched, fully formed, and then pursued it. It was more the cod fishery is changing in the late 17th, early 18th century. It used to be really self-contained. Ships would come over from England with their crew, with their supplies. They'd set up shop in a cove in Newfoundland, and at the end of the season, they'd take everything and everybody, including their dried salt cod, back to Europe, and the crew would get paid off. But then you have settlers they usually call them planters at this time in Newfoundland, staying year round and hiring 4 or 5 men. So you need a bit of a crew to catch the fish, clean them, dry them, and so on. And it's in that context that the Americans see an opportunity. And they see, if we can get in there and sell supplies, because for the Newfoundland fishery, everything has to be imported, including food, salt, everything. The Americans get in there, and that's when they start bringing in rum, and that's when they start distilling rum, actually, as part of this strategy for horning in on the British Newfoundland fishery. And I found some complaints by British officials in Newfoundland saying the Americans will supply a fishing entrepreneur, but only on the condition that they take a certain number of barrels of rum. Like, they cannot refuse the rum if they want to get the rest of their supplies. So there's a way in which all along the line, someone's pushing rum. It's not just being asked for. It's not like people say, I have an idea. Maybe you can get me some rum. It's always being pushed by the American exporters onto Newfoundland merchants and fishing entrepreneurs, and by them onto their crew. So, where does the impulse come from? Of course, the men are not saying no to a drink of rum, so it's not against their will in that sense, but it's for the benefit of the suppliers, if you will, and playing on the needs of the drinkers, who of course get addicted, may be too strong a word, but basically habituated to this sort of thing. So it's an elastic demand, and there's always a sort of a demand for more and more, if you will.
And then when those not the breweries, but the distilleries were created in Canada, in Halifax and in Montreal, was it sort of like the same, like pushing on to fellow Canadians this liquor that they were, distilling, or was it sort of like a different relationship?
By that time, it was all, the whole system was already in operation.
Part of the economy.
And it was more a matter of kind of import substitution. It was, here's an opportunity. We're importing all this liquor. There might be an opportunity to just manufacture some here, because there's clearly already a demand.
Mm-hmm.
By this time, there's a demand, and they're meeting a fraction of it. Even after there's 2 distilleries in Halifax, Nova Scotia is still importing rum from abroad, and likewise in Quebec.
So it was part of the economy of the staples trades at that point, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Now, alcohol clearly helps to create social bonds, and it did back then too, but it also introduced a lot of risks, right? Which you talked about, you looked around and there were 7 fights going on at one time earlier. So what kinds of conflicts or problems do you see drinking creating in these workplaces in the historical record?
There's a way in which, to use a phrase of Craig Herron's, it's kind of drinking on the job is not only allowed, it's encouraged and almost mandatory. Usually not, like knocking back liquor while you're out in your fishing boat, although that did happen. It was normally at the end of the day. But in any case, that much alcohol around, of course, makes for a lot of safety risks when you're out on the water. I've got lots of stories of Northwest Company voyageurs, canoes capsizing in rapids. And was that because the crew was drunk? You don't know for sure, but there are some indications that that was so there's a frequency of accidents.
Yep.
The Northwest Company voyageurs, who often had, as you probably know, domestic relations with Indigenous or Métis women. There's lots of reports of quite horrible spousal abuse. So violence between men, violence inflicted by men on women, this sort of thing. And then there's a whole chapter on the effects of rum in the fur trade on indigenous people, where it has terrible effects. I don't know. I could talk about that if you wish as well, but
Yeah, go ahead, please.
so the Northwest Company, and here more so than with the voyageurs, it's a matter very much of inflicting this upon indigenous societies. A lot of some indigenous people were interested in alcohol at the beginning. Many weren't. The Dene of Northwest Territories, for example, initially were quite resistant to it. They didn't like it, and pressure was brought to bear on them to get them hooked.
Mm-hmm.
And most indigenous people at this time used alcohol differently than Europeans done. They had never before been exposed to intoxicating beverages. In places like Mesoamerica, further to the south, they did have their own forms of, fermented cactus juice and corn and that sort of thing, and various customs for keeping that contained. But these were populations that had never been exposed to it before, and these were populations, and I'm generalizing here, and of course we're talking about many, many different cultures, but the tendency, by and large, is for the experience of being very drunk, of not just a little bit, but being fully intoxicated, was intoxicating in a different sense of the word. That is to say, it fit in with spiritual practices such as chanting and drumming and dancing that were designed, or not designed, but were associated with leaving behind the mundane world of everyday experience and experiencing an altered mental state.
Mm-hmm.
And rum seemed to give this to people. And so it was often valued, and as I say, almost all these indigenous societies approached alcohol very differently than Europeans. They didn't drink more than Europeans, I want to underline. All the indications we have is that European colonists probably drank more on the average than indigenous people, but indigenous people exposed to the fur trade drank differently. So on the one hand, they integrated into their cultures in their way, just as they integrate European products and sometimes European religion and so on into their own culture. But what comes with that is a breaking down of inhibitions. And these are mostly small-scale societies without coercive governmental forces, where people get along by keeping a lid on aggressive impulses. Children are brought up to be tolerant of others, to not react directly to, for example, slights, insults, sexual jealousy, one thing and another. So alcohol, for them, as for everybody else, breaks down some of these inhibitions and barriers. And what ensues in many cases are quite violent episodes. Again, often directed by men against women, but also men against one another. You have people burning down their homes, stabbing other people. And I know, when I talk about this, and I write about it, I try to be very careful not to play into racist stereotypes. And I also add that on the long run, when indigenous societies came to see how dangerous this substance can be, many of them took vigorous steps to combat it.
Mm.
You have various um, uh, religious and social movements. For example, the one led by Handsome Lake in the Haudenosaunee, who preach abstinence, and they preach the idea that alcohol is a poison brought by Europeans to destroy us, which is not too far, not exactly far fetched, and and that it's important not to take it. And they have, I've come across various incidents where they have used collective force to eject traders who are supplying people with rum. So I don't want to suggest that indigenous societies were helpless in these cases. They often were initially intrigued by something that was novel and presented an unprecedented kind of mental experience.
Mm-hmm.
It was hard to resist. Uh, Pathologies resulted, and people made an effort to do something about these pathologies, which they associated with colonialism, quite rightly.
And that, I guess that sort of reflects a broader trend in society too, right? Like by the end of the 19th century, temperance reformers began criticizing workplace drinking and, using alcohol as economic leverage. So what drove that shift? Were there two things driving that shift, or was there one singular sort of causation? And we see both of these, the indigenous communities and broader society, kind of having the same idea at the same time.
So, in colonial societies of Canada, temperance movement starts to make a real impact in the 1830s. And one of the points just to link to our last topic
Mhm.
that I make is the indigenous nations were there 100 years earlier. Like they had started, denouncing drunkenness and alcohol long before the colonists did. Anyway, so in the colonial societies, starting in the 1820s, but really making an impact in the 1830s and 40s, you get this temperance movement where they're calling for people to stop drinking. Uh, First of all, it's stop getting drunk. Then it's stop drinking altogether. And then in the most extreme case in New Brunswick, by the 1840s and 50s, they're calling for prohibition, like using the law to eliminate it. Um, so I think your question was, why and why then?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of reasons. It's connected with the evangelical movement in Protestant Christianity. It's also connected, maybe a different aspect of this of essentially the same thing, with a different kind of economy. They're the beginnings of industrialization. Um, there is a growing sense that we need a workforce that is steady and regular on the job, and that is, kind of responsible in its behavior off the job. And that contrasts with what I've been talking about before in, say, the fur trade or the fishery, where what they want is for fur trade voyageurs, for example, they have to work like 18 hours a day at full out for brief periods, and there's no question of leisure at all. And they face danger, and they have to develop a kind of macho attitude to their job. They have to consider themselves heroic, and that alternates with long periods of downtime. So what these traditional industries wanted was, devoted, brave, strong men that could accomplish amazing feats. Uh, once in a while. What industry, mechanized industry that's starting to grow in the 19th century wants is workers who show up at the right time, work steadily through that time and then go home,
Mhm.
behave themselves. And that's a very different kind of set of demands. A fisherman or a voyager would have been very badly equipped for factory work, and a factory worker would have been terrible as a fisherman or a voyageur because it's just different kinds of behavior. I'm saying I associate the temperance movement with that shift to a whole different kind of work culture that is associated essentially with modernity, we'll say.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're coming to the end of our time, so I just want to ask you one more question. For people who are interested in Canadian business history today, whether they're a student of it or a researcher or an academic, what do you think is the most important takeaway from this research?
Um, hmm. So that's something I hadn't given much thought to up to this point. I guess it's to be aware of the role of, in a very general sense, drugs in work relations in early modern economies.
Mhm.
It was rum in early Canada. It was, other kinds of habit-forming substances, coffee, sugar, tea, and various other kinds of stimulants, marijuana, and so on that operated in coca leaves in South America that made it possible for work to be done and profits to be made.
Mhm. It's very interesting, right? Especially in light of, I guess we have, that we're seeing cannabis be legalized all around North America and in Europe and in different places. So it's impactful, I think, in that industry as well. This research to think about sort of how it correlates. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out, anyways.
Well, and one thing I say in the book is that in today's world, workers in extractive industries, they do use drugs and alcohol, but
Mhm.
but employers don't encourage it. It's probably a natural byproduct of their life that's so socially isolated. Um, but it's not built into the employment relationship, which it was in the 18th century.
Yeah, very different relationship with it, I guess, today. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that takes us to the end of our time. So, Alan, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And on behalf of the entire Canadian Business History Association, thank you, viewers, so much for joining us today. And we will see you in the next one.